This audio is recorded by John Lothe. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 14. World War II. The Tide of Aggression, 1939 to 1941. Introduction. The history of the Second World War is a very complex one. Even now, after hundreds of volumes and thousands of documents have been published, many points are not clear, and interpretations of numerous events are hotly disputed. The magnitude of the war itself would contribute to such disputes. It lasted exactly 6 years, from the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, to the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945. During that period, it was fought on every continent and on every sea, in the heights of the atmosphere and beneath the surface of the ocean, and fought with such destruction of property and lives as had never been witnessed before. The total nature of the Second World War can be seen from the fact that deaths of civilians exceeded deaths of combatants, and that many of both were killed without any military justification, as victims of sheer sadism and brutality, largely through cold-blooded savagery by Germans, and to a lesser extent by Japanese and Russians, although British and American attacks from the air on civilian populations and on non-military targets contributed to the total. The distinctions between civilians and military personnel and between neutrals and combatants, which had been blurred in the First World War, were almost completely lost in the Second. This is clear from a few figures. The number of civilians killed reached 17 millions, of which 5,400,000 were Polish, while Poland had less than 100,000 soldiers killed or missing in the Battle of Poland in 1939. Polish civilians, to the number of 3,900,000, were executed or murdered in the ghetto subsequently. The armies which began to move in September 1939 had no new weapons which had not been possessed by the armies of 1918. They still used infiltration tactics, with columns of tanks, strafing airplanes, and infantrymen moving in trucks, but the proportion of these and the ways in which they cooperated with one another had been greatly modified. Weapons for defense were also much as they had been at the end of the previous war, but, as we shall see, they were not prepared in proper amounts, nor were they used in proper fashions. These defensive weapons included anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns with controlled fire, minefields, mobile artillery on caterpillar tracks, trenches, and defense in depth. Germany used the offensive weapons we have mentioned in the new fashion, while Poland in 1939, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in 1940, the Balkan countries, and the Soviet Union in 1941 did not use the available defensive tactics properly. As a result, Hitler advanced from one astounding victory to another. In the course of 1942 and 1943, new weapons created by democratic science and new tactics learned in Russia, in North Africa, and on the oceans of the world made it possible to stop the authoritarian advance and to reverse the direction of the tide. In 1944 and 1945, the returning tide of Anglo-American and Soviet power overwhelmed Italy, Germany, and Japan with the superior quality and the superior quantities of their equipment and men. Thus, the war divides itself, quite naturally, into 3 parts. 1. The Axis advance covering 1939, 1940, and 1941. 2. The balance of forces in 1942. And 3. The Axis retreat in 1943, 1944, and 1945. The Germans were able to advance in the period 1939 to 1941 because they had sufficient military resources and used them in an effective way. The chief reason they had sufficient military resources was not based, as is so often believed, on the fact that Germany was highly mobilized for war, but on other factors. In the first place, Hitler's economic revolution in Germany had reduced financial considerations to a point where they played no role in economic or political decisions. When decisions were made, on other grounds, money was provided, through completely unorthodox methods of finance, to carry them out. In France and England, on the other hand, orthodox financial principles, especially balanced budgets and stable exchange rates, played a major role in all decisions and was one of the chief reasons why these countries did not mobilize in March 1936 or in September 1938, or why, having mobilized in 1939 and 1940, they had totally inadequate numbers of airplanes, tanks, anti-tank guns, and motorized transportation. There was another reason for the military inadequacy of the Western powers in 1939. This, of even greater significance than the influence of orthodox finance, arose from conflicts of military theories in the period 1919 to 1939. Several violently conflicting theories held the stage during the 20 years of armistice and paralyzed the minds of military men to the point where they were unable to provide consistent advice on which politicians could base their decisions. In Germany, on the other hand, decisions, not necessarily correct ones, were made and action could go on. One theoretical dispute raged around the role of tanks in combat. The tank had been invented to protect advancing infantry against machine gun fire by its ability to put machine guns out of action. Accordingly, tanks were originally scattered among the infantry to advance with it, both moving at a rate of speed no greater than that of a man on foot, consolidating the ground yard by yard as both moved forward. This view of the tactical function of tanks continued to be held in high military circles in France and England until too late in 1940. It was sharply challenged, even a decade earlier, by those who insisted that tanks should be organized in distinct units, armored brigades or divisions, and should be used without close infantry support, moving as perpendicular columns, rather than in parallel lines against the defensive formations, and should seek to penetrate through these formations at high speed and without consolidating the ground covered, in order to fan out on the rear of the defensive formations to disrupt their supplies, communications, and reserves. According to these new ideas, the breakthrough made by such an armored column could be exploited and the ground consolidated by motorized infantry, following the armored division in trucks and dismounting to occupy areas where this would be most useful. In France, the new theory of armored warfare was advocated most vigorously by Colonel Charles de Gaulle. It was generally rejected by his superior officers, so that de Gaulle was still a colonel in 1940. This theory was, however, accepted in the German army, notably by Heinz Guderian in 1934, and was used very effectively against the Poles in 1939 and against the Western Front in 1940. At full strength, a German panzer armored division had 2 regiments of tanks and 2 regiments of motorized infantry, plus various specialized companies. This gave it a total of 14,000 men, with 250 tanks and about 3,000 motorized vehicles. In September 1939, Germany had 6 of these panzer divisions, with a total of 1,650 tanks, of which 1/3 were 18-ton models, with a 37mm gun, Mark III, while 2/3 were 10-ton models, Mark II. By May 1940, when the attack was made in the West, there were 10 armored divisions with a total of 2,000 tanks, some of which were the new Mark IV model, a 23-ton conveyance carrying a 75mm gun. No major increase occurred in the next year, but the number of armored divisions was doubled by splitting the 10 which existed in May 1940. Thus, in June 1941, when Germany attacked Russia, it had 20 armored divisions with a total of 3,000 tanks, of which several hundred were Mark IV, but 1,000 were still Mark II. In opposition to these, Poland had only a handful of tanks in 1939. France had over 3,000 in May 1940, and the Soviet Union had, in June 1941, about 15,000 scattered tanks, almost all light or obsolescent models. A second theory which paralyzed the Western powers in the years before World War II was concerned with the superiority of defensive over offensive tactics. This defensive theory, of which the Englishman Basil Liddell Hart was the most voluble proponent, assumed that attack would be made in lines, as the Western powers themselves were trained to attack, and that such an attack would be very unlikely to succeed because of the great increase in firepower of modern weapons. It was argued on the basis of the experience of World War I that machine guns could hold up advancing infantry indefinitely, and that artillery fire, carefully placed and ranged so that it could cover the field, could prevent tanks from silencing the defensive machine guns to allow infantry to advance. The Maginot Line was based on these theories. As such, it was not a defense in depth, which would seek to break up offensive columns by allowing them to penetrate to varying depths, thus separating tanks, infantry, and artillery so that each could be dealt with by proper weapons as impetus was dispersed. But was a rigid line, which sought to stop the offensive lines in front of it as a whole. The theory of defensive superiority left the military forces of the Western states with inadequate offensive training, poor offensive morale, and unable to come to the help of distant allies, like Poland. It put a premium on a passive, indecisive, inactive military outlook, such as shown by Pétain or Gamelin in the years leading up to 1940, and left them unable to handle any real offensive when it came against them. The theory of continuous defensive lines, which must be kept intact or instantly reestablished whenever they are breached, created a psychology which was incapable of dealing with an assault which came at it in columns and inevitably must breach any defensive line at the point of impact. When this occurred in 1940, French military units threw down their arms or tried to make a precipitous retreat to some point where a new continuous line could be reestablished. As a consequence, the Poles in 1939, and, to a greater extent, the French in 1940, were constantly abandoning positions from which they had not been driven, until units were too broken up to allow hope of reestablishing any continuous line, and France proved to be too small to permit continued retreat. The only alternative seemed to be surrender. As we shall see later, another highly effective alternative was discovered, mostly in Russia, by 1942. In the interwar period, there was a third theory, violently disputed, about the effectiveness of air power. In its most extreme form, this theory held that the chief cities of Europe could be destroyed almost completely in the first 24 hours of a war, devastated by high explosive bombs and rendered uninhabitable by gas attacks from the air. This theory, frequently associated with the name of the Italian general Giulio Douhet, was much more prevalent in civilian circles than in military ones, and played an important role in persuading the British and French peoples to accept the Munich Agreement. Like most far-fetched ideas, it was supported more frequently by slogans than by logic, or by facts. In this case, by mottos like, "The bombers will always get through." The chief facts to support the theory were to be found in the Spanish Civil War, notably in the German destruction of Guernica in 1937 and the ruthless Italian bombardment of Barcelona in 1938. No one paid much attention to the fact that, in both of these cases, the targets were totally undefended. The military advocates of such air bombardment, most of them considerably more moderate than General Dewey, concentrated their attention on what was called strategic bombing. That is, on the construction of long-range bombing planes for use against industrial targets and other civilian objectives, and on very fast fighter planes for defense against such bombers. They generally belittled the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery and were generally warm advocates of an air force separately organized and commanded, and thus not under the direct control of army or naval commanders. These advocates were very influential in Britain and in the United States. The upholders of strategic bombing received little encouragement in Germany, in Russia, or even in France, because of the dominant position held by traditional army officers in all three of these countries. In France, all kinds of air power were generally neglected, while in the other two countries, strategic bombing against civilian objectives was completely subordinated in favor of tactical bombing of military objectives immediately on the fighting front. Such tactical bombing demanded planes of a more flexible character, with shorter range than strategic bombers, and less speed than defensive fighters, and under the closest control by the local commanders of ground forces, so that their bombing efforts could be directed, like a kind of mobile and long-range artillery, at those points of resistance, of supply, or of reserves which would help the ground offensive most effectively. Such dive bombers, or Stukas, played a major role in the early German victories of 1939 to 1941. Here again, this superiority was based on quality and method of usage, and not on numbers. In the three major campaigns of 1939 to 1941, Germany had a first-line air force of about 2,000 planes, of which half were fighters and half were tactical bombers. On the other side, Poland had 377 military aircraft in 1939. France and Britain had about 3,500 in 1940, while the Soviet Union had at least 8,000 of very varying quality in 1941. At the outbreak of war in 1939, ideas about sea power were so generally held, and with such firm conviction, that they were questioned only occasionally. One of these ideas was that sea power was dominated by big gun capital ships, all other vessels serving simply as accessories to this backbone of the fleet. A related idea assumed that an area in which a fleet could function effectively was limited by the positions of its major bases, such as Pearl Harbor, Gibraltar, Singapore, Toulon, or Kiel. Another idea, rarely disputed, stated that no landing could be made from the sea on a defended shore. These ideas on the nature and limits of sea power had received only minor challenges in the interwar period, except from the extreme advocates of air power, like General William Mitchell of the United States Army Air Force. Such extremists, who insisted that land-based planes could make all battleships, or even all navies, obsolete, did not succeed in convincing the admirals or politicians. In the United States, Mitchell was subjected to a court-martial and forced to resign. Although the experiences of the Second World War did not support the extreme advocates of air power, either in respect to the Navy or to strategic bombing, the ideas of land warfare, and especially of sea warfare, which were prevalent in 1939, had to be drastically modified by 1945.